Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, who will then pass on to our other speakers. And our first speaker will be Maryanne Loughry. Joseph Manning is an associate in the corporate program at Ceres, a nonprofit organization founded here in Boston in 1989 that advocates for sustainability leadership among investors, companies, and public interest groups. At Ceres, he advises companies on sustainability strategy in areas of governance, performance, and disclosure, as well as facilitating stakeholder engagement processes. Prior to his joining Ceres this year, Manning served as chair of the Sierra Student Coalition, the national youth chapter of the Sierra Club. And he represented the Sierra Club at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at various meetings in Copenhagen, Cancun, Durban, Doha, and Warsaw. Additionally, he's conducted research on climate change and renewable energy policy in Canada, Ecuador, and Northern Ireland. He has a master's in public administration in environmental science and policy from Columbia, and he is a proud BA graduate of Boston College here. Please join me in welcoming our newest favorite Eagle alumni, Joseph Manning.
Well, thank you all for being here today. Is my mic working? Yes. Great. So it's my honor to introduce our two panelists and to moderate this session. Thank you, Eric, for the introduction. And as Eric said, so what's going to happen today is we're going to begin with about 10 minutes each of a presentation from our two panelists. Then I'll lead about a 30-minute discussion on between the two of them. And then we're going to open it up for hopefully another 20 to 30 minutes of conversation for all of you. So prepare your questions now. We're hoping for a lot of them. So to begin with, our first panelist is Dr. Maryanne Loughry. She's a Sister of Mercy and the Associate Director of Jesuit Refugee Services in Australia. Dr. Loughry has been associated with Jesuit Refugee Services since 1986, and through JRS, worked in Indo-Chinese refugee camps in the Philippines, in the Vietnamese detention centers in Hong Kong as a psychologist and trainer. Dr. Loughry is a research professor at Boston College's Center for Human Rights and International Justice and the School of Social Work. She is a research associate of the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University, where she had previously been the Pedro Arrupe tutor for over 7 years. Maryanne has researched the impacts of displacement on forced migrants in numerous settings, including the Middle East, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Uganda, and Sierra Leone. More recently, she conducted research about the links between climate change and forced migration in the Carteret Islands in the Pacific. In 2010, Maryanne was also awarded the Order of Australia for her service to refugees and displaced persons. Also, we have Dr. Tétreau. Oh, sorry. I'll introduce you both at the same time, and then we'll go to there. Sorry. Edouard Tétreau is a French essayist, columnist, and political and economic consultant who has advised European governments and business leaders. He specializes in anticipation and management of financial crises, which he has taught at the leading French business school, HEC Paris. In the United States, Edouard served as a trustee of the Washington, D.C.-based think tank, the Committee for Economic Development, and is a member of the advisory board of La Nation Française at Columbia University. He is a member of the Pontifical Council for Culture's Scientific Committee.
Cortile de Gentili.
See.
Which is part of the Pontifical Council.
Wonderful. Okay. Smaller version of it. My apologies. And Edouard is the author of 4 books. His most recent one, Beyond the Wall of Money, was published on September 9th by the French press Stock and coincides with Pope Francis's visit to the United States. Beyond the Wall of Money has been described as an antidote to the increasingly inhumane world at risk of being overrun by the combined powers of money and technology. So can we have a big welcome to our two speakers?
Can we go now? Thank you very much. Clearly, I'm excited to be here and to be talking to you. The purpose of my presentation today is to try in a little way to bring the people really affected to our discussion. I was very, very impressed with our presentations yesterday, and I think what we are doing is just continuing to add to the dialogue that we were encouraged to have by the Cardinal last night. What I want to do in particular is to focus on the most vulnerable people, as Francis has done. I want to pursue the argument, though, that while they are presently impacted and vulnerable, it's not because of their own lack of agency, but rather because of the debate that is dominated by global powers. And that without the conviction that we are one single family, globalized indifference will continue to dominate our reaction, our response to the needs of these people, and will prevent us from changing our consumptions and also our convictions. What I'm going to do in this brief presentation is talk about 3 issues. I'm wanting to talk about the very notion of vulnerability, which I've already started. Also the issue of relocation as adaptation, and possibly the coordination that's necessary to assist those who may have to move. What I'm going to do is highlight one case study, and the case study is the one that's already been referred to, which is the Carteret Islands. My map will show you why possibly I've sort of had this particular interest. As you can see, the Carteret Islands are off Australia, and then they're also off Papua New Guinea, which is our neighbouring country, and then further again. The Carteret Islands 60 years ago, were recorded as having food insecurity issues, 60 years ago. In 2007, CNN and many other media outlets referred to the people of the Carteret Islands as the first environmental refugees in 2007. In 2015, these same people have had to take matters into their own hands while their government, other small nation states, islands, and the international community continue to debate what's the best and most agreed response for people like these. That brings me to vulnerability. First of all, living proof that I've been to the Carterets. And there I'm talking to one of the women elders who actually often goes to the big climate conferences, Ravenna. To get to the Carteret Islands, long story, but basically a banana boat for 3 hours from Bougainville. My return from Bougainville, we ran out of fuel twice. I'm not in a hurry to go back to the Carteret Islands. The Carteret Islands are, and this is significant, the Carteret Islands are an atoll. And one of the unfortunate things for being sort of the first environmental refugees, if we do stay with that term, is that there's quite a deal of still disputed science as to how much the effects that they're experiencing on the Carteret Islands are due to climate change and how much it's due to tectonic plates moving, and that's what normally happens to atolls. So while this debate has been going on internationally, the Carteret Islanders, as one of the first identified population, have been caught in the science. Just a few more images so that you have a sense of what we're talking about. When you arrive, you're quite sure you've died and gone to heaven. It's absolutely beautiful, pristinely beautiful. The waters, it's everything you dream of, no internet, no electricity, no satellite. There is housing, very basic housing. They live, you can walk around these islands. Within an hour, you can go around the whole perimeter of the islands. There's about 2,000 people living on the Carterets. This is famously one of the islands that allegedly, because of sea rise, has been cut in half by the environmental degradation that's occurred. Certainly what you do see is water inundation. You do hear stories of being unable to grow crops. You hear stories of salination. You also see pictures of crops that have failed because of the salination. And you hear from the people where they used to have their land, where they used to have their houses. Additionally, though, there's another issue. Climate change is not the only cause attributed to the problems that the Carteret Islanders are having. There's overpopulation. There's also a disputed term, modernisation. And there's even been some reef damage done by the way people fish, sometimes by throwing the occasional stick of dynamite onto the reef to get dead fish. They have certainly, though, in their time been recognised as not being passive, whilst over the 60 years or whenever we want to start, it's been recognised that these islanders have problems. As a matter of fact, many of them have already left the Carterets and are working on the mainland. But what they have done is left behind members of the family to keep their land, even if the land's no longer able to be farmed or productive land, to keep their shrines, their graves, their families' graves. They also send remittances. Remittances look like tinned food. So they send to the people of the Carterets food to help combat the food insecurity that's there. They've been adapting for decades. There are sea walls. There are people, as I say, living in and out of the atolls. They have tried different approaches to actually growing different things. They have very little emission of greenhouse gases. They are one of the lowest emitters in the world. Their vulnerability is also their strength, especially in the political arena. Now I want to look at relocation. In the last IPC report, there was a paragraph accorded to the fact that we need to think about human security, human insecurity, and movement, and the mobility of people as a result of climate change. So it's now on the international agenda, even though these people have been responding to this for years. When consulted, the Carteret Islanders have said, yes, we want to move. They have actually been moved 3 times. And they have been failed attempts. The times that people have moved, there's been 2 reasons why they haven't succeeded. One is because of the hostility of the host country, host communities, and I think you need to bear in mind very clearly there's no such thing as empty land, unowned land. So when people in the past have moved from the Carterets to different land, and it's been on Bougainville, which is a semi-autonomous area of Papua New Guinea, what's happened is there's been hostility. Hostility to where they've resided, hostility to fishing, hostility to how they've actually had to adapt their lifestyle. And so when there's been conflict, they've had to return. There's also been inadequate consultation with the host community about these people, so there's been a great deal of fear. We know from previous relocation efforts in the Pacific, and you just have to think about relocation efforts that we've had, for example, around when we've had nuclear bombing in the Pacific. So we've done it sometimes around other development or different sort of initiatives, not just climate change. We know that there are problems. Think the Three Gorge Dam. It's not normally being planned appropriately or resourced adequately, resulting in communities becoming more vulnerable. So I'm picking up again on our vulnerability rather than less. Thus far, this is what the Carterets have experienced. The people of the Carterets have been confronted with 2 options. One is to continue to adapt, and the other one, of course, is mitigation. But as I've said earlier, they're one of the lowest emitters in the world. mitigation efforts may be too late for the Carteret Islands. However, we need to understand that talk of relocation has made them very, very nervous because of these previous failed relocations, and things like our thinking of relocation, ours being the Western world in particular, around people moving as a total family, people leaving their lands behind, people kind of not having then a political voice where they come to. These have become real live issues. They can inform future policy. What is more apparent is while they are affected, these people are not at this stage being able to bring much to the discussion, and their voice needs to be heard. My third point is, should there have to be a future relocation, what about coordination? How can this actually happen? And I want to digress for a minute because you, like many of my colleagues and like me a little bit, might be thinking, well, some of these efforts that have failed might be, well, the Papua New Guinea's government might not have been able to do it or not as good. The first time I became aware of the issue of relocation wasn't with the Carteret Islanders, it was with the Inuit people in Alaska. And there's a lot of research around this, and as you know, we're now talking in a US sort of jurisdiction. And there's famously been indicated that at least one other group of people have also started to move, have also been identified as needing to move. But what stopped them moving is 25 different jurisdictions that have to sign off on where they can move to and how they can move. Think when you've moved house. Just think that alone, when you have to get new electricity, new gas, new telephones, it's the same on a bigger scale. So coming back again, there is a proposal for there to be an establishment of an international climate change displacement coordination support mechanism. And the purpose of that would be to provide assistance to people like the Carteret Islanders to actually be able to move and not to be made more vulnerable. In 2006, the Carteret Islanders took life in their own hands and actually created an organisation called Tuela Pesa, which means riding the waves. They gave up on waiting for the government, their own government, to actually help address their needs for relocation. It's a small initiative. It's an initiative that cannot manage the whole population. It's an initiative supported by the Catholic Church, who did identify land. One of the things I want to bring to your attention is, though, that as we talk about an international mechanism, what I think the Carteret Islanders can bring to our discussion out of their vulnerability is the need for any coordination to be listening to the voices of the vulnerable as close to home as possible, because they've already had failed attempts. They know who they want to move, they know how they want to move, and they also know which cultural groups need to go in particular movements. So any international sort of coordination needs to be firmly grounded with the most vulnerable in order to be able to do it adequately. So the lessons I want to bring to you in this first 10 minutes, the vulnerable people are acting. They are already responding. Assistance is needed, but at the appropriate level, and coordination is imperative. We also already have invaluable lessons to learn. I believe that these are not completely new issues to us. We have been for a long time, as a Catholic Church, as an audience, working with the poor. And I think Laudato Si goes a long way to showing us that the directions that we already know need to be built on so that we can assist the most vulnerable of our time. Thank you.
Voilà. It is very humbling to speak after Sister Maryanne for many reasons. It's difficult to have a more contrasted, to have two more contrasted speakers in many respects. Sister Maryanne is a woman, I'm a man. She's in the clergy or ordained. I'm a lay. You don't have that.
On it.
All right.
Ordiné.
Settle down.
Ordiné. She's from down under, from what I understand.
That's true.
And I work up above, not only in France, but as a matter of fact, she's helping the poor, the poorer, the displaced people. I'm working, I'm advising, I would say the rich and powerful in Europe, advising the equivalent of European Fortune 500 CEOs, etc. So we could not have a more contrasted approach. She's an expert in climate change. You will see that I am not. However, we have a few things in common, and I would like to expand on that. I think one clear thing we have in common is the sheer conscience of our extreme vulnerability as human beings, rich or poor, from down under or up above, in front of what is about to come. And if you give me a few minutes, and I think I have these 10 minutes, I will tell you that we are confronting not only a wave, heat wave, flood wave due to climate change. We are about to be confronted, we're already being confronted by three other waves. Waves of crisis or tsunamis. The first one, very linked to climate change, is I would call the migrants wave. I'm witness to that in Europe, and it is just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg. How this migrants wave, very linked to climate change, as we are seeing on Syria, how this wave is just about to at least challenge, potentially break down what we call in Europe the Westphalian order, governments, states, be it in France, in Germany, in the UK, in Spain. The debate today is, as a resident, as a citizen, I pay for my social security, for my medical care. I don't want to pay for this wave of migrants coming at my home, etc. Or really, you don't. And what happens if they start to have a disease like tuberculosis? What if they start to have disease that can contaminate your whole neighborhood? They're just part of your country. They're part of your neighborhood. You're sure you don't want to pay for them as well? We have a big challenge coming up. The technological wave. It's a keystone in my book. I know it's not an easy one to hear in a country that is very advanced in terms of technological progress, that is benefiting a lot from it. I enjoyed my ride with Uber from my hotel to here today. But then it's even cheaper than in France. But then I reminded a recent interview of the CEO of Uber, saying the problem with the fact that Uber is quite expensive is it's because of the other dude in the car. So we are investing 80% of our R&D to make sure that the other dude, quote unquote, is not in the car anymore. So what will happen with all these other dudes when the algorithms, when the robots have started to displace them? It's another displacement wave. The Oxford University has referenced it in a quite good study, saying that of the 500 jobs in categories of professions in the United States, 47% of them are at risk to be replaced by algorithms in the near future. The third wave is the financial one. That's my, how do you say, my ballpark. That's my, this is where I work. I was in New York during the 2008 crisis, working for a big financial institutions, hundreds of billions of dollars under management, etc. We saw the floor opening below our feet. And I'm witness to the fact that it was a matter of sheer luck that the system did not break up, implode. It was a matter of sheer luck that you could still go to your ATMs and take money outside of your bank. I remember as if it was yesterday the superb words of President Obama saying that Wall Street needed adult supervision on its activities, contrôle parental, as we say in French. 7 years ago, I think we can make the case, without spirit of polemics, that it is actually Wall Street that has taken a form of adult supervision on what is happening in and being decided in DC. I'm amazed, you call it the citizen, notably United array from the Supreme Court. I'm amazed by the wave of money that is flooding in Washington, D.C. today. I think we've heard a senator yesterday giving a clear example of that. And I'll come back to a sentence that Pope Francis took away from his speech in D.C. in front of the Congress last week. But the financial crisis in front of us stems from the fact that we had a warning with 2008. We ignored it. And instead of trying to work around our excess of debt, excess of leverage, almost excess of money going around, nous avons guéri le mal par le mal. We cured the disease by the disease itself. I won't drown you with numbers, but here is one from McKinsey, which is not exactly a Bolshevik institution. Today, when you add the total private and public debts of the different countries worldwide, you end up with a $199,000 trillion of total debt. That increased by $57,000 trillion since 2008. Add to that the quantitative easing, the fact that we have today destroyed the very notion of interest rates by putting a zero figure or even negative interest rates on this very important parameter. You have a financial system that is probably living close to its last round. My clients and the S&P 500 and the Fortune 500 in Europe, etc., they don't know what to do with the excess of cash they generate. They simply don't know what to do. You take the level of share buyback and dividends that S&P 500 companies in the US have done last year, 90% of the profits have been given away in dividends, share buybacks, capital reduction. And still, despite of that, the level of cash within the various companies is at an all-time high ever. Companies, not only private equity firms, but companies, net wealth individuals, don't know what to do with their money because there is simply too much of it. I have a few ideas on the way this flood will materialize. Maybe we'll come back to that later. But I think we are living an interesting time where an extreme financialization, an extreme digitalization coupled with what is going on with the climate change, and at a pace faster than everybody thought of no more than 20 years ago. I think that was one of a big key takeaway from yesterday's presentation. We are seeing these 4 waves coming up to us. Now, what do we do in front of it? I have 2 good readings to suggest to you. But before that, a preemptive question. Who does read and speak French in the assembly? All right. Well, there will be, we'll discuss it later. There will be competition between you because I only have 5 books to offer, but it will have your names on it. My book is only published in French as of today. Large chunks, notably the briefing notes that I prepared for the Vatican last year in the run-up to Pope Francis' visit to the US this year, is already in English. But I want to quote another more important reading, and it's a shorter one, and which will probably serve as a matter of introduction, I hope, for our debate. I'm sure some of you are familiar with these sentences. The thing is, in terms of this flood, this tsunami that is coming ahead of us, we've been here before. We have been here before. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. Oof. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. And then comes one sentence. And then the beginning of the rebirth. And then the possibility of, no, actually, we can survive it. We can come through. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So it's the flood, the deluge. I don't know if we are living through a similar time, but it is the possibility that indeed we are going to face a similar challenge. There are 2 ways to answer it. One is, and unfortunately I'm seeing a lot of that in the business and financial world I'm living in. The first reaction is, foutu pour foutu. You know, if the deluge, if the flood comes, well, I'll try to make the most out of it before the deluge happens. And we say in French, après moi le déluge. After me, the flood can come. I don't care. There is a bit of an attitude to that. However, I do also see reasons for hope, concrete hope, because concrete actions are being taken. In your country, your people, every year gives $300 billion, no less than $300 billion in philanthropy. Your country is the country of the Giving Pledge. Your country is the country that has built up the technological tools to prepare the ground for what we call the sharing economy, economy of sharing, to be enabled notably via internet devices. And the other reason for hope is that very sentence in the Genesis. It only takes one man. It only takes one woman. It only takes the action of one person wherever he or she is to change the story. I am quite optimistic about the prospects of COP21. If you were to have told me a year ago, you see, Edouard, in 2015, China will have committed for a nationwide cap and trade deal, will have signed a joint a joint statement with the United States of America to say we're going to do the most for COP21, etc. To have seen India say we are going to have at least 40% of our energy coming from renewable sources, I would have said it's a joke. It is happening. But probably more important than what the governments will decide is, because then it takes time. And we've seen yesterday that we are running short of time. We need to have business and finance far more engaged in this process, far more committed, not the lip service commitment that is too often the case of socially responsible investments, etc., but real effective ethical finance. If you allow me the time later during the debate, I will try to sell to you first my idea of a second Bretton Woods that would involve three categories of players that were not present at the first Bretton Woods. It's business, corporations, it's religious societies, because Catholics, not only Catholics, but the various religions of this world have a lot to say about how the vulnerability of human beings are key to weather what is coming. And so basically, and financial institutions. I'll leave you with one number, one only. You know that today, investments on capital markets are being made at the speed of light, thanks to algorithms. You know that 2/3 of investments on the stock market are being decided by robots. Here is another figure. Take the 500 largest investors in the world, the Fidelity, Putnams of this world. Every year, these guys invest no less than $75,000 billion per annum. They invest the equivalent of the GDP of the earth. If we can find a way to contaminate their conscience, to work effectively at the speed of light, to allocate equity in such a way that we start really to change the flow of climate change, of the dangerous forces that are being developed in our economy, I think we can get a chance not to run to our arch too soon.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you both for the introduction and your remarks. So let's start with a discussion about what this means and what comes next. So Maryanne, you gave us a wonderful example, well, not a wonderful example, but a good example of of some of the first climate refugees, environmental refugees we're seeing. Can you talk to us from your experience with Jesuit Refugee Services about some other examples that are occurring around the world today?
You know, thank you. I think there's 2 points I'd like to mention before giving examples. One of the points is, and I sort of slightly hinted at this, the term refugee is quite a disputed term in referring to people who are moving. They certainly don't meet what we call the 1951 Convention because they don't have the well-founded fear of persecution, but more significantly than that, when I've talked to people in Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Carterets, they don't want to be refugees for 2 reasons. One of the reasons is because they actually are not, they don't see themselves as against their own country. It's their own country that is with them suffering this need to possibly leave their own land. But secondly, and this is the one that always has saddened me greatly, is that they also don't want to be seen as refugees because they have an image of refugees behind barbed wire looking sad. And as I've indicated, they're incredibly active. So Jesuit Refugee Service has been looking at displacement in the Pacific. As I've indicated, I've been to a number of these very, very small island states. The biggest insight I have from them is that climate change is one of the factors that's impacting them. It's a very significant factor, and sometimes in some parts much more significant than others. But we also have, now this will surprise you, urbanisation. People move from the smaller atolls or the smaller islands to the capital, which often is a very small capital, but that's where education is, it might be where electricity is, it might be where the internet is. That creates problems and food insecurity and pressures. They also have, like for example, the Carterets, people had previously been living on Bougainville, and there was a war that sent people back to their atolls. So other things, other factors are moving people. So while the Pacific is seen as like the canary in the mine, if I can say that, one of the things we're becoming very aware of is that climate is like the tipping point of many other factors that are making some of these states not viable any longer, or at least some of the atolls that are part of the states not viable. I was also, though, I've been to other parts of the world that equally are contentious. I think climate plays a huge role in many of these parts of the world. Just to give you another one that is, I've worked a lot in Gaza. And in Gaza, the access to water is a big issue and becoming an increasingly big issue. And it's to do with climate change, but it's also to do with neighbouring countries' use of water. You would know the discussion that we have about Darfurian refugees and Darfurian camps. That wasn't about conflict between different ethnic groups. That was about access to resources, access to water. So some of the places where we work, climate is one of the very strong factors, but it's not the only factor. What's most significant though is how it's labelled or how it's addressed. And again, one of the issues that we have is the issue, and I think Edouard's also starting to touch on, we're often siloed, so the refugee agencies will deal with the refugees without actually having a political response to the climate issues or the water issues, which are just seen as problematic. So if you take, for example, the Syrian displacement right now, food shortages are part of why people are now moving to Europe. And it's exacerbated by climate. But there's many other factors as to why there's food shortages, including donations and the lack of funding. So we have to be across we in my business have to be across all of these issues at the highest level so that we can respond appropriately when we're working with the most vulnerable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's such a great takeaway, because whether it's Syria, which both of you have mentioned now, or many other parts of the world, the UN came out just a couple weeks ago with an estimate that over the next 10 years, there'll be 50 million refugees or displaced peoples as in some fashion as a result of desertification and other environmental changes. So how do we take, and both of you should feel free to respond to this, how do we take the lessons that we're learning today in crises like Syria and make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes and that we build a better system to incorporate these migrants going forward?
Maybe just to start, it's I said, like Edouard, we've been here before and we're going to be here again and again, but we are learning as we go along. But I think with the issue that you're talking about with the Syrians, when the people are moving, they're voting with their own feet. They're taking their own action. What I've tried to indicate with the Carteret people, they're extremely vulnerable, but because of us, not necessarily because of their own actions. Their own actions are very proactive, and yet we often see them as, oh, those poor things. There's already, from Bangladesh and the Mekong Delta, just to name two, huge movements of people every year because of climate. But we haven't necessarily called them climate migrants yet. We haven't even necessarily acknowledged. We just see them as the poor of Bangladesh or whatever. But so I think we need to recognise that this movement's not about to be upon us, it's clearly upon us. And people are taking their own actions.
Right.
Now, there's certainly ways that we can facilitate that more. Visas, work opportunities, movement pathways where people don't have to storm Hungary or whatever. So there's clearly responses that the institutions can make. But again, I keep going back to the vulnerable are the ones actually taking the steps at the moment while we debate what should go on.
Great.
I wanted to add. Does it work?
Yeah.
Is it on?
It's not on. I wanted to add to give you one thought and one anecdote, a Vatican-esque anecdote. But the thought is about the vocabulary we now use, and it's a very recent phenomenon, to talk about migrants. Migrants is a word, les migrants in French, is a word that did not exist 5-6 years ago. We had two words. We had les immigrés, the immigrants, so people coming to live where we are, or les émigrés, people who had left their home to go somewhere else, so people who had left a home. It's very subtle. It's only two letters that have been taken away, immigrants and emigrants. But it means a lot. Why? Because an immigrant, well, you need to organize society so that he has a place to live by yourself. An emigrant, you need to take care of the home, the country he has left, to make sure that it does not go in shambles. A migrant can flow, too bad for him or for her, drowns in the Mediterranean, that's bad, but he's a migrant. He's not coming to us, and he did not leave home. I wanted to give you this reflection because I think in the very words we use, there are the roots of something quite evil, I have to say. Making sure that immigrants or immigrants are left in a permanent state of wandering around. Sorry for excuse my French. The second point, to completely agree with Sister Maryanne, is in the Vatican, you have the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, who was represented by its president, Cardinal Turkson, yesterday, and Father Oxenin, who was one of the masterminds of the encyclical. The Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace is in a very administrative building in the Vatican, and just one floor below is the Pontifical Council for Immigrants. I think there is more than a geographical neighborhood to that. I think the two issues and challenges of our societies are very much intertwined. We can do whatever amounts of quantitative easing, of how do we say in French, changing labor laws, etc. If we don't deal with the migrant issue, i.e. if we don't deal with the climate change issue at its root, it's wasted money. To anticipate a question, if I may, from Jason, what do you think of the $100 billion per annum price tag that supposedly would be the cost to deal with climate change? We are talking 0.14% of global GDP. We are talking peanuts. If we are not able to pull together that kind of resource, what kind of global village, global society are we?
Yeah. So along those lines, in the debate, one of the things that's emerging as a central theme of the upcoming COP21 negotiations is this idea of loss and damage, which is an idea of a formalized mechanism where countries like the United States who have historical responsibilities for climate change help pay for damages in countries that have not contributed significantly to climate change over the long run. Is this a mechanism that you two feel might help our more vulnerable communities? And if so, might you follow up on what would require to make that type of mechanism successful?
I'll start, but it's a bit controversial the way I want to start. Two things again, if I just keep staying with my case study. Papua New Guinea has some of the world's best resources in the world. Gold. Bougainville had the biggest open cut copper mine in the world, and that's where the Carteret Islands are just off. It's not owned by Papua New Guinea. Australia played a big role in the colonial times, but it's then been sold on, and who knows who owns some of these mines now. And they've certainly contributed to immense degradation. I mentioned Bougainville had war. It had war over that mine. It had civil war for more than 10 years, and the mine is not reopened. So there's resource and finance on the doorstep. The controversial part is the government also is not the best when handed large amounts of money. I hope they don't hear me say that. I'm going there in a couple of weeks' time. So finance can be a part. Finance is necessary, but how it gets at the most appropriate level and how decisions are made for expenditure by people whose very lives are being impacted needs to be sought through, but also at a very fast pace because of what's already happening. Tulila Pesa is using small amounts of money to relocate small groups of people, but it's a very powerful symbol. But they can't do more because they don't have the political influence, but they also don't have the money. But too much money can overwhelm an initiative like that. So while I see finances as very significant, the issues that I'm saying is we already have some access to monies and it's not being appropriately allocated. So that's where my biggest concern would come, but then I defer to the economist now.
It's a shared concern. On this point of how do you call it, loss and damage, I would like to refer to a very interesting suggestion in the encyclical, which is the concept of an ecological debt. The idea that we, as historically heavy polluters, the world, we owe a number of countries a debt. Interestingly enough, those countries to whom we owe are very indebted. I notably think about quite a number of African countries. I think there is something to explore here. Leviticus chapter 25, the Jubilee. It's a very interesting the Jubilee. The idea of the Jubilee is every 7 days a human being has to rest in order to continue its activity. The Leviticus also says every 7 years the earth needs to, otherwise we will kill her. And every 7 times 7, every 49 years, because human beings are such that they build on their power, credits, and a relationship of creditor to debtor is such that it ends with indebted people or countries unable to pay back their debt. Well, in ancient times, when you were not able to pay back your debt, you would go in jail. You would end up as a slave. A country ends up in slavery today if it's not able to pay back its debt. Hence, the very strong words, and in my view, very justified, the strong words of Pope Francis at the UN against the IMF and the poor job it has done on such countries as Greece, etc. There is, I think, the encyclical, through the concept of ecological debt, opens a very interesting possibility to redeem quite large amounts of debt from some of the poorer countries in the world, and I chiefly think of African countries. As a European, not talking about white man's burden, but this burden exists. As a European, I know that Europe will survive, prosper, or fail, or end in chaos if we do the right things with and for Africa. And I think part of doing the right things is a large redemption of debts. It is a shame of the international community that some of the poorest countries, like Mali, still have a debt on their balance sheet and still owe money to French, German, American creditors. So those the idea, and I think the ecological debt is a very interesting tool that can open up this possibility.
Great. Well, I know we've spent an hour talking up here, so I want to turn the mics over to you guys so you can ask questions of our panelists. Just raise your hand and someone with a microphone will come around and give it to you. Yeah, right there in the front.
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm especially interested in the thought that you had about having a second Bretton Woods. And of course, the first Bretton Woods brought us the IMF and the World Bank and a number of sister organizations. What I'm interested in is what your hope would be could come out of a second Bretton Woods.
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. My strong belief as a financier is that we are living the very last years of the Bretton Woods system. It is exhausted in many respects, and I think that the next financial crisis will call it to an end. Bretton Woods 2 would, in my view, take the following route. We need to bring to the table those constituents that were not there at Bretton Woods number 1. Bretton Woods number 1 was all about governments. We know the power of governments, but we also see today the very limits of these powers. What can a government, however powerful, what can they do with its limited and limiting national interests? What can it do against climate change, against or to accompany digitalization, financialization? So who do we bring on board? One, corporations. I do believe that I will not quote names but maybe less the largest, the most established 20th century corporations, and I do believe that the Elon Musks, the Mark Zuckerbergs, the Apple, Microsoft, etc. of this world are today not only strong stakeholders, but have the technological, financial, and cultural capability to radically change the patterns of our economy. We need them on board. That's constituent number 1. Constituent number 2, we need these top 500, or say the top 50, and the rest will follow, largest financial investors. Okay, you have the two weapons, digital economy and financial capital. At the center of the conference, well, not leaders, because they would compete for share of voice, but economists of the various religions. And this is where, if I may, my book and the ideas in my book step in. When I started this book, the idea is how to prepare post, following the next financial crisis. I was thinking of doing exclusively the Catholic social doctrine teaching, preferred option for the poor, the idea that a society, a human society, cannot survive if we continue to give preeminence to the strongest, the fittest, the most competitive elements of this society. Who could be more competitive than an algorithm in many professions tomorrow? So I was looking, I wanted to exclusively do Catholic social doctrine. And then a Jewish friend told me, but Edouard, if you wanted to succeed, bring everyone on board. And you know what? The Jews, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists, they all have quite interesting things to say about the role of money and technology in our economies and societies. And then I started to open books. Some of them I was familiar with. Leviticus chapter 25. You know, Judaism is not about building vast amounts of wealth. It's about the redemption of debt. Islamic finance. You know, Islam funds were some of the least affected by the 2008 crisis. Reason is, they don't invest in speculation. The idea that this chair, because of a speculative environment, can be worth 2 or 3 times more in the future, forbidden. They don't invest in usury interest rates. So CDOs based on subprimes, no way. Islamic finance is also about l'aumône, how would say, the idea that you must, by obligation, give a portion of your revenues every year.
Alms.
Yes.
And so on. Buddhism is more about well-being rather than the accumulation of wealth, etc. To end like that, my idea is the following. Get these economists around the table. Try and have them work on a common agenda. And by the way, it's not a bad idea in a world where, for political purposes, religions are about to go against one another, to have them work on a common practical agenda, prepare what would be the right investment criteria for capitalism the day after, and with this set of recommendations, concrete principles, it's about, do you invest in a company that allows children to work? Do you invest in a company that uses tax havens? So we can have very concrete examples. I think we can change the world with that.
Great. Thank you. Next question. Yes.
Hi, I've been doing some thinking over the last few months about how one would structure new global governance systems given our new financial and climate realities. In the world of social work, one of the things that we think about constantly is the role of voice. And that's something that Maryanne talked a lot about today, especially our misperception that vulnerable populations are vulnerable due to lack of their own agency versus oppression of their agency. So as we think about something like a new Bretton Woods, Maryanne, how do we bring voices that are never invited effectively, not sort of, really not disruptively, effectively into global governance conversations like the one just discussed, so that we marry the vulnerable with the powerful in formation of new structures like this?
Thank you. I was thinking of something similar when Edouard was talking earlier. If you take again, if we go back to the Syrian crisis, and of course what we saw recently was the death of a toddler, changed big politicians and started to change policy. But it hasn't kept that momentum. It did bring about some change, and then some rationalists stepped in, and we're in the middle now of a new sort of period of time. So I think my biggest concern, and Tiziana, it's a good question, my biggest is not only how to bring the voice, but how to maintain the voice, or to maintain the rage, or how to, because in my discussions with people who are deemed to be vulnerable around climate change, they will tell me that they play every card. So they will go to the small island developing states meetings, And if that doesn't get enough momentum, they'll go to the indigenous people because that gets more momentum. And they will move depending on where the action is. And they're very good at that. They're possibly more astute than we are because we're talking about survival here. But then how to keep that momentum, I think, is the bigger challenge. How to keep that being significant. So when you were saying, Edouard, about, bring the first 50 and the others will come, I agree. But like, how do we make sure that the first 50 come? And I know there have been some global initiatives where, with sufficient, like Davos, as I understand it, with sufficient, you get the right people and everybody wants to be there as such. But they're not necessarily the people who, as I'm concerned about, who can tell the narrative of what you mustn't do, because, I've worked enough at the UN level to know that there's an awful lot of waste and an awful lot of discussion that doesn't go where we want it to go. But I do know it's one of the only shows in town. So it's how to strengthen it rather than to bring it down, I think, is part of it. But I'm very, yesterday was very much in listening to the Cardinal in particular, like, what role can Francis bring, or what role can the moral voice bring that can maintain a discourse that will bring along the voices that I say we've done before. We've worked with the poor and we know the poor. So how do we help them to be the voice in a way that it's authentic? And that's why I'm terribly mindful I can't be that voice. I can see some of the issues, but they are much more powerful, but they are often not invited. I'm invited. So how to sort of work that?
If I may, to follow your lead, Maryanne, and your question, Tiziana, it's true that in my idea, the representatives of the various religions are indeed the ones who represent really the sacred, because vulnerable nature of our human beings. The fact that you do not have only CEOs and big money and big business and big government at the table, but people who have the clearest conscience of our vulnerability and hence our sacred nature. But you're clearly right. Religious figures, however human they may be, will not probably be able to convey as much witness, testimony, strength as the
people
victims,
themselves.
the people themselves.
Yeah.
That's very true.
Great. Next. All right, we got.
Could you comment on how we're dealing with the present Syrian refugee crisis, particularly with regard to countries like, I think, Hungary, that's put up fences to keep them out? And then how do we prepare? Second question would be, how do we prepare for the wave of 50 million that you talked about in the next 50 years?
The response to the Syrian outflow there's a number of different levels. If I can just address a couple of them, I've actually said publicly here at BC, the refugees are not the crisis, Syria's the crisis. It's a conflict crisis, and what we're seeing is the product of a crisis. So clearly a political initiative, which I'm seeing in the last days with Obama talking to Putin, with my own government, the Australian government, saying maybe Assad needs to stay in a bit longer. I'm not saying I support that, but I'm seeing political shifts as we speak. So there is that need, because the vast majority of people have not moved to Hungary or to Europe. They are nearby, near their own businesses, near their own houses, in Lebanon and in Turkey. There are some who voted with their feet and moved on, but they're still the minority. Those who have moved on are being addressed by, at the moment, benign and so not benign governments. Europe itself is trying to work out a universal response, which it has not come to readily. And in the meantime, what's become very evident is people, us, are actually taking the response into our own hands. So there's been a generous outpouring in many countries. As Edouard said, migration is not going to go away, and these sort of movements will continue and will overwhelm our present system until we have valves or outlets like appropriate visas where people can come in to visit relatives, to find work, etc., and can do that in their own country by making an application rather than having to go across many countries before they can even get into an embassy where they can make an application. So there's going to have to be changes, there's no question. And I saw this, I was in Europe in June, and I saw in Calais the beginnings of this. And it was terribly evident that they were not going to be able to manage Calais, and the channel was about to be overwhelmed, which happened, and now we're just seeing it. So it's not as if we didn't even know about it. This has been watched as such. And we've talked about relocating people who need to be relocated from Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan for years, but it hasn't happened. So, I mean, what I'm concluding a bit from this whole discussion, and I'm finding it very helpful, is sure, the talk needs to happen, and I heard yesterday the dialogue is terribly important, but in the meantime, things happen while we're dialoguing, and we need to speed up a lot of these dialogues, big time. So the dialogues are still necessary, but the pace of which we're doing it is just either killing people or, as I say, making them take risks that we wouldn't want anybody to take. What I've also said, though, is here in the US, I've had the chance in Lebanon to visit the assessment that happens for people to come on here to the US by the US government. And I know it's a very, very rigorous assessment to ensure that the right people or not the wrong people come in. So I'd be putting a lot of pressure on the people that have already been assessed on the government here to move more in, because it's a very, very thorough assessment. So I think there is a need to bring some particularly vulnerable people in now, but I think the bigger effort needs to be the political effort.
Right. Thank you. Next question. Can we actually, we've got a lot from this side. I want to make sure this side gets them, so we'll get started in the back there. Sorry, we'll come back to you guys.
Hi. So my question, I think, is more directed at Edouard as the economist. And a term that gets used a lot in terms of trying to, for the countries around the world and the earth to deal with the reality of limitations is sustainable development. And I've heard some people kind of literally look at that and call it an oxymoron, because is it realistic? I remember from looking at statistics and things probably 20 years ago or 10 years ago. If everybody in the world lived at the same lifestyle as we do in the US, we take 3 planets to support that kind of lifestyle. So I guess the question I have is, even with some of the hopeful things that came out yesterday of, better technology and solar and so forth, with it, and I guess going from 8 billion to 11 billion people in another 30 years, how realistic is it that countries around the world, the Indians and the Chinese and the Bengalis, should certainly be able to live as well as we do, but how realistic is it that the planet can support lifestyles anywhere close to what we have in the States and in Europe? And so as an economist, I guess I want to ask you, is sustainable development a realistic concept, or do we have to fundamentally change our expectations about how we live and how we consume? And so, please.
Thank you. Two answers. One, I do believe that sustainable development, as the corporate world has envisioned it, has executed it so far, is indeed an oxymoron. It is about marketing tools, certain sections of the annual report, labels, but it goes nothing beyond that. To give you one clear figure, you take the equivalent of the S&P 500 for Europe, so Eurostoxx 500. It's a survey made by Roland Berger. 13% of chief sustainable development officers, so people responsible for sustainable development, only 13% of them report directly to the CEO. To me, it's a very clear indication of, okay, it's a side issue. It will change the day when you put a price, when you put a financial incentive, a solid one, onto that. Hence, if I had only one disagreement with the encyclical, and I think it's a temporary one, I think we should give another go to giving a price for the emission of carbon pricing. The first experience has been a disaster. It was about corruption. It was about, we should give it another try. Until we do not find financial incentive or l'inverse, financial disincentive to pollute, nothing will happen. Two, should we radically change our way of life, consumption? Here I 100% adhere with the encyclical. I think that there are very important paragraphs in the encyclical where Pope Francis says, it's not about the number of people. The very idea that we would be too many on this planet is a very toxic idea. At the end of the day, you end with a one-child policy in China, and I spent quite some time with China. I cannot think of a more barbarian decision that can be imposed on the people. The challenge is not the number of people, it's the way we live. Absolutely. Hence the Fiat 500 at the arrival of Pope Francis in DC. Yes, it's and it's not about finger pointing A, B, or C. It's not about finger pointing America or the UK. Or we all need to change that. And it's here we are talking principle of subsidiarity. That's another story.
Great. Right in front of you.
Thank you both very much for your presentations. I find them challenging, and also I see some bit of a flaw in some of it from my perspective, and I have to say that it's from my perspective. It's really following upon the question that was asked at the very end of the seminar last night in relationship to women. I agree, and I have agreed, that we need to change the Bretton Woods systems, for example. Been working with that kind of idea for years, really, when you look at what the reality has been because of those institutions. To form a new Bretton Woods, or to have Bretton Woods 2, whatever it will be, the lack, I think, is what the lack is in the encyclical. Nowhere in the encyclical can I find a verbal mention, really, specifically of women. And the most vulnerable people in our world are women. Whether you want to admit that or not, the statistics will bear that out quite dramatically. The people who move usually will be the men leaving the women behind. I've worked in Brazil, and I have that experience in terms of the Northeast, and have done some work in Central America. So in your idea about the corporations and the religions, it frightens me. Not that I think they shouldn't be there, but the group that's left out is, how do you make sure that women will be involved? Because if you go to the religions, what you saw in terms of the Pope's visit would be an example that you would see in the Muslim world, in the Jewish world. It doesn't matter. What you saw was the invisibility, really, of women in prominent positions. It was all men. And so when we speak about these corporations, there are very few women. You speak about religion, there are very few women. And women at the table is really what ordination is all about. I want to just make that clear. it's women, and today in the news, Francis very nicely said that's not possible. Now, he didn't say it wasn't possible because God said it wasn't possible. He said it wasn't possible because John Paul II said it wasn't possible. I ask you to think about that. But anyway, if you have women at the table where the decisions are made, I believe, from my own experience, that you're going to get a very different perspective and a very different agenda in terms of what the needs of the world are and what is needed in terms of moving forward towards a society, a world of sustainability and of justice and peace, because you have to have those things combined. So
Great.
if you both would comment on that, because the refugee situation and your situation really has to bring that to the forward in every talk. The language is important, and when you don't have those words mentioned, or that particular group, which is over half of our human race, you're going to get us what we have now.
All right.
The only comment I have is an applause. It's spot on. It's
So
my
what
only.
will you do about it in terms of make your presentation?
Well, first, be at the table. No, but I mean, it's you've underlined, I think, a big flow in probably, quite a visible flow in last week's trip, and a big flow in at least my demonstration. So give me an occasion to come back. But spot on.
So you'll bring it up when you'll add it to
I mean,
your...
what I had not thought about is indeed if you start to convene the various religions, I say, where are the women? Indeed.
Can
So we need to fix that.
Can I just, in my field of work, which is forced migration, the vast majority are children.
Right.
They're women, and the numbers are women and children. But you can also say the vast majority are men and children. It's the children that carry the numbers. So it's not men that are the movers. It's women and children, or the children, whoever they're accompanying. So I think we have to bring the future very much. I agree with you about women being particularly vulnerable in some of these settings, but I also know that women are very much the people who are making a lot of the actions on behalf of the people themselves. But I'd want to bring very much the children from my field.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but maybe you can snag our guests on their way out. Or maybe not. Maybe they'll just run out. You'll have to see. But thank you all. And remember that this, whether it's this conference or the Pope's encyclical, is about beginning the conversation, not ending it. So we hope that the conversation that began today will be carried on by all of you going forward. And additionally, there's a reminder that this afternoon at 4:30 in Robsham Theatre, there'll be a discussion by Dr. Chichinlitsky, and she'll be discussing the role of COP21 going forward, and we hope to see you all there.
Thank you.